You filthy woman! You stepped on my gown!
Rosemere Hall. Servants froze. A plainly dressed maid staggered backward, one hand pressed against her cheek. Miss Evadne March stood over her in silk and diamonds, eyes burning with disgust. "You filthy woman," she hissed. "You stepped on my gown." The maid lowered her head quietly. No tears, no apology. No one noticed a cold power in her silence. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Lord Basil Thorncroft entered moments later, smiling, unaware of what had happened. Evadne rushed into his arms like an angel. The slapped maid simply adjusted her gloves. Then engines roared outside. 3 black motor cars bearing the Fairmont crest swept into the drive. The chief steward entered, removed his hat, and bowed deeply before the humiliated maid. "Your Grace." The room stopped breathing. What happened next destroyed lives. Duchess Isolde Fairmont was a name spoken carefully in drawing rooms across England. Even men who commanded banks and ministers who shaped laws lowered their voices when speaking of her. Since the death of her husband, the late Duke of Fairmont, she had ruled the family affairs alone with a calm strength few could challenge. Her London residence, Fairmont House, stood behind iron gates in Mayfair, its polished windows overlooking a street lined with motorcars, private footmen, and houses filled with old money. Inside were marble floors, oil portraits of stern ancestors, crystal lamps, and corridors so quiet that even whispers seemed to behave. Though powerful, Isolde had slowly withdrawn from public life after her husband's passing. She no longer attended every ball or opera night as she once had. Younger families knew her name, her fortune, and her influence, but many had never met her face to face. They imagined a harsh old woman wrapped in black silk and bitterness. None of them knew the truth. Isolde was elegant, disciplined, and deeply observant. She had learned long ago that the world revealed itself best when it believed no one important was watching. Her greatest devotion was her only son, Lord Basil Thorncroft. Basil was 28, broad-shouldered, warm-hearted, and handsome in the easy way that made strangers trust him quickly. He had inherited his father's title prospects and his mother's refined features, yet none of her caution. He was generous with money, kind to children, and incapable of believing that beauty could hide danger. Isolde had guided him carefully since childhood, hoping experience would one day teach what warnings could not. Then Miss Evadne March entered his life. She arrived in London society like a polished jewel. Her gowns were always perfect, her smile carefully measured, and her voice soft enough to invite attention without demanding it. At dinners, she spoke just enough to appear clever. At dances, she moved with graceful confidence. Mothers approved of her manners. Gentlemen praised her beauty. Newspapers mentioned her frequently beside the names of titled bachelors. Within months, Basil was completely devoted. He brought flowers to her townhouse. He rode beside her carriage in Hyde Park. He defended her before anyone who questioned her intentions. Society celebrated the romance as though it were already a wedding. Only Isolde remained unconvinced. She noticed Evadne never greeted servants unless others were watching. At charity functions, her eyes wandered more toward diamonds than the suffering she claimed to pity. Her laugh warmly with dukes, lords, and wealthy widowers, yet dismissed ordinary guests with the smallest flicker of impatience. Her words were sweet, but something cold lived beneath them. When Isolde tried to speak gently to Basil, he grew irritated. "You judge her because she is young," he said one evening over roast pheasant, buttered carrots, and warm bread served in the blue dining room. "I judge her because I listen. You have never approved of anyone. I would approve of honesty." He pushed back his chair harder than intended. "You fear losing control." The sentence struck deeper than he knew. Their conversations became strained after that. Basil visited less often. Letters replaced dinners. Fairmont House, once filled with easy laughter between mother and son, became quiet. Then, a rainy morning, a cream envelope sealed in gold wax arrived on a silver tray. Mrs. Bernadette Sloane, mother of Miss Evadne March, formally requested the honor of receiving Duchess Isolde Fairmont at Rosemere Hall in Surrey before any engagement announcement was made. It was written with perfect manners and obvious ambition. Basil considered the invitation proof that everything would now heal. "They wish to welcome you properly," he said. "No," Isolde answered calmly. "They wish to impress me." That afternoon, she sat alone in her private sitting room, where tea cooled untouched beside the fire. Beyond the windows, London mist clung to the gardens. She thought of Basil's trust, Evadne's smile, and the future that waited if appearances continued untested. By evening, her decision was made. The next morning, while Basil expected his mother to arrive later in full dignity, Isolde dismissed her lady's maid and opened an old wardrobe herself. From it, she removed plain servant clothing once used during charitable visits to hospitals and kitchens. A dark dress without decoration, a simple apron, sturdy shoes, a modest cap to conceal her hair. She removed her rings one by one and placed them in a velvet box. When her loyal steward asked whether she was certain, Isolde fastened the final button at her wrist and looked into the mirror. The powerful Duchess disappeared. In her place stood a woman no one would notice. She lifted her gloves and said quietly, "Let us see how they treat those they believe beneath them." Rosemere Hall stood proudly on the Surrey countryside like a woman wearing borrowed jewels. Its stone walls were grand, its gardens trimmed into neat perfection, and its long gravel drive curved elegantly toward tall iron gates. From a distance, it appeared every inch the home of ancient nobility. Up close, the illusion weakened. The statues near the fountain were newly carved and too bright. The family crest above the entrance had been recently mounted. The hedges were cut with such precision that they looked more expensive than natural. It was a beautiful house, trying very hard to look old. At the rear entrance, deliveries of flowers, meat, pastries, and wine arrived one after another. Kitchen boys ran with baskets of bread. Footmen polished silver trays until their hands reddened. The house smelled of roasted duck, cinnamon tarts, fresh polish, and expensive perfume drifting down from the upper rooms. Into this chaos came a modest woman in plain servant's clothes, carrying a small case. No jewels shone at her throat, no silk trailed behind her. Her hair was hidden beneath a simple cap, and her gloves were ordinary. She stood quietly at the servants' gate while rainwater clung to her sleeves. No one recognized Duchess Isolde Fairmont. A stout housekeeper looked her over with quick disdain. "You are late." "I was told to report this morning," Isolde answered softly. "Then report less and move more. We are not running a convent." She was pushed inside without another glance. The servants' corridors were narrow and busy. Bells rang from drawing rooms above, voices snapped through the halls. One maid carrying folded linen nearly collided with a footman and was cursed for her clumsiness. Another girl was scolded because a flower arrangement leaned slightly to one side. Fear moved through the house faster than air. At the center of it all was Mrs. Bernadette Sloane. She swept through the breakfast room in a satin gown heavy with lace, rings flashing as she pointed at everything wrong with the world. The table held smoked salmon, eggs, fruit preserves, hot rolls, and silver coffee pots, yet she found reason to complain over each item. "These strawberries look common, and who arranged those lilies? Have they no eyes?" A trembling maid adjusted the flowers. Bernadette turned to a guest list beside her plate. "By this time next month, no one of consequence will ignore our invitations." She laughed at her own words. Later, passing a half-open morning room door, Isolde heard Bernadette speaking to a neighbor. "Old noble families are finished. Titles without money are museum pieces. We are the future now." The neighbor laughed politely. Upstairs, Miss Evaden March prepared for Basil's arrival. Isolde was sent with fresh tea and entered quietly enough to witness the young woman before the mirror. Evaden wore pale silk with pearls at her throat. Two maids pinned her hair while she practiced expressions, one after another: warm delight, modest surprise, gentle concern. She studied each smile carefully, choosing which would best capture Basil's heart. "Too eager," she murmured at her reflection. Then she softened her eyes and tried again. "Better." When she noticed Isolde in the room, her face sharpened at once. "Set it there and do not breathe on the tray." Isolde obeyed without comment. By noon, the household was tense with expectation. Basil was expected any moment. Isolde was instructed to carry a silver pot of tea through the upper corridor toward the drawing room where Evaden waited. As she passed, the narrow edge of her shoe brushed the hem of Evaden's gown. The sound of the slap cracked through the corridor. Gasps followed immediately. Tea rattled in its cups as Isolde staggered one step sideways, one hand rising slowly to her cheek. Red marks bloomed across skin that once had been kissed by kings at formal greeting. Evaden stood rigid with fury. "You wretched creature, do not touch what you could never afford." The nearby servants lowered their eyes in horror. No one dared speak. Isolde straightened carefully. She lifted her gaze to Evaden's face. There was no pleading in her expression, no shame, no fear, only silence. Evaden mistook it for submission and smiled coldly. "Clean the tray and be useful." She swept away in silk and perfume. The corridor remained frozen until footsteps faded. A young maid beside the wall began to shake. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the older woman who had endured the blow without a word. "Why did you not strike her back?" she whispered. Isolde adjusted her gloves with calm fingers and picked up the trembling teacups. "Because," she said quietly, "some debts grow larger when left unpaid." By early afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving Rosemere Hall washed in pale sunlight. Gravel glittered along the drive, and the household stiffened with anticipation when the sound of an engine rolled through the grounds. A polished dark motor car swept to the front entrance and stopped beneath the stone portico. A footman hurried forward to open the